Hi, my mom works in an office and I've seen how it is. This video isn't for hype or just a story for use. It's about what thousands of people go through every day. Everything is based on real situations, so you can recognize yourself and avoid repeating other people's mistakes. All names, companies, and addresses are fictional.
I was halfway through the final negotiation day in Geneva when Camille, with her perfectly pressed blazer and immaculate smile, threw me a curveball. She glanced over at me, looked at the supplier across the table, and with all the subtlety of a practiced power move said, "Would you mind grabbing us some coffee while we get started?" Her words were sweet, polite, but I heard the unspoken edge behind them. She wasn't asking. She was giving orders. At least she thought she was. The fact that I'd been the one to build this entire contract from the ground up, every language translated, every risk assessed, didn't seem to matter to her. I caught Mr. Lemoyne's eye. The supplier I'd spent months building rapport with, who trusted me to navigate the maze of legal clauses and cultural intricacies of the deal. I didn't look at Camille, not once. I didn't flinch. I simply turned to Lemoyne, smiled, and said quietly, in perfect French, "Have they informed you of the liaison transfer?" His eyes widened, just for a second. Then, as if it were instinct, he stood, and without hesitation, in flawless English, said, "Cancel the deal." Camille froze. The smooth mask she wore cracked for a split second. Her confident smile faltered. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. I could see the shift in the room, the energy. It was palpable. Lemoyne collected his papers, never once making eye contact with Camille, and calmly walked out of the room without a word of explanation. His departure wasn't a dramatic exit, but it was an exit all the same. He was done. I remained in my seat, carefully placing my printed copy of the contract on the table and sliding it towards Camille. It wasn't a confrontation, just leverage, a quiet reminder of why I'd been the one to bring in this deal. I highlighted clause 7.4b and slid it across. No words, just a subtle statement of power. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be confrontational. It was cold, calculated, and absolute. At that moment, I knew Camille would be scrambling to fix the mess she'd just made. There would be no recovery in the next few hours, and certainly not before the investor meeting that was scheduled for Friday. Her polished confidence was gone, replaced by the realization of a mistake so fundamental she had no way of covering it up. 2 weeks later, back in New York, it was clear how far-reaching the consequences of that moment had been. The panic had set in faster than I had anticipated. Legal was already scrambling, trying to figure out how they could find a workaround to fix Camille's error. They'd found that, in her haste to take control, she had overridden the liaison designation without informing legal. There was a paper trail that no one could deny, emails, calendar invites, and system logs confirming it all. But the real damage came when Lemoyne's company withdrew the proposal entirely. We were left with nothing but a damaged relationship and a hefty loss. And even worse, Camille's attempt to spin the situation as a timing issue had no traction when the hard evidence laid everything bare. The financial fallout wasn't just about the $9.3 million lost in projected margins. It was more than that. It was the reinitiation process. Weeks of delay and a disrupted pipeline that couldn't be fixed with a phone call or a quick email. Camille had set herself up for this fall, but the real beauty of the situation wasn't in her failure. It was in how quickly and completely she fell from grace. I didn't make a big deal about it. There was no need. I just watched. I let the paperwork do the talking. It was going to be her who had to clean up the mess. All I had to do was sit back, wait, and make sure she didn't think she could walk back in with a smile and reassert control over what was already mine. And she did try. Later that afternoon, I received a Slack message from her, thinly veiled as an attempt at damage control. "Hey, can we talk briefly? There's a misunderstanding I'd like to clarify, off record if you prefer." I didn't reply. Instead, legal took care of it for me. They sent a memo to the executive team that afternoon, making it clear that the override of the liaison designation had triggered Clause 7.4b, effectively nullifying the contract and rendering all further negotiations invalid. No more coffee runs, no more polite talks, no more chance to explain away the damage. That memo, sent from legal to the top brass, was Camille's final attempt at controlling the narrative. It had failed before it even reached their inboxes. I watched from my office as the pieces slowly fell into place. By the time the board met, the issue was already clear. Camille's attempt to rewrite the story was over before it even began. The boardroom scene was more than just a meeting. It was an exposure. Camille's smile had been replaced with a look of uncertainty. She tried to explain away the problem as a simple timing miscommunication, but when Lemoyne's formal withdrawal letter hit the table, along with my clause, translated, time-stamped, and clear, there was nowhere to hide. The chairman leaned forward, eyes locking on her. "Why didn't you inform legal before replacing the liaison?" Silence followed. Camille opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was over. By the end of the month, HR had sent out the official announcement. Camille's role was pending transition. It wasn't long after that she was gone. The timing had been perfect. She'd moved too fast, misread the stakes, and exposed herself. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply carried on with my work, knowing that the real victory was in the clause I had inserted years ago, buried under layers of meticulous paperwork. It had worked exactly as I had intended. Quietly, silently, but with perfect execution. And one day, I passed our new junior hire in the break room, holding 2 coffees. He smiled, telling me, "Grab these for Camille." I nodded, handed him the printed form, and said, "Just make sure you don't forget to update the designation next time." He didn't ask questions. He just nodded back. In the end, Camille had tried to edge me out. She didn't understand that I didn't need to fight for control. I already had it, quietly, legally, and strategically. It wasn't long before Camille's true intentions became crystal clear. The subtle signs, the ones that I could see but didn't immediately confront, started piling up. At first, it was the emails. She began copying herself on every communication with vendors, as though to claim ownership of the entire process. Then came the uninvited prep calls. Just 2 weeks away from the finalization of the deal, I was suddenly excluded from the loop, told there was a time zone conflict, a polite way of saying they'd excluded me. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I knew better. I'd been in this game long enough to understand the power plays that came with an ambitious newcomer eager to make their mark. If I'd protested, I would have played right into her hands. Instead, I sat back, calmly observing, gathering everything I needed to act. I opened up the contract prep document, the one I'd been working on for months. It had every detail carefully thought out, every clause written with precision, every potential risk accounted for. I went straight to the section that had saved us before, the one that had nearly cost us the Mauritius rollout because a vendor had tried to pull a fast one. Clause 7.4b, the one I'd written after that debacle to protect us from exactly this kind of maneuvering. It read, "If any negotiation is transferred without written notification to the primary liaison, this agreement is voidable at supplier discretion." I sat back in my chair, staring at the words for a moment. This clause, this little line of text, was about to be my ace in the hole. It was a safeguard I'd added 2 years ago to protect the company from exactly what was happening now. They hadn't informed me, the primary liaison, of any change in the negotiation team. They'd tried to sideline me without following the right protocols, and that meant this deal, this carefully negotiated $78 million pipeline, was now at risk. I printed out the document and grabbed a highlighter. Slowly, I marked the relevant clause and translated it into French. No fanfare, no urgent calls. Just the quiet, methodical work of a professional who knew exactly what was at stake. I let the ink dry and placed the documents in a folder. All I had to do now was wait. It wasn't about making a scene or pushing my way back into the negotiation. It wasn't even about confronting Camille directly, though I knew she'd made a critical mistake. It was about control, patience, and letting the right moment unfold. I wasn't the one who had overstepped. I didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. I simply needed to hold on to the power that was already mine. For now, I stayed in the background like I always did. The calls were happening without me. The emails were being forwarded without my name on them, but I didn't need to rush in. I had the leverage, and sooner or later, Camille's misstep would expose itself. The next few days passed quietly. Camille didn't seem to notice anything was off. She was too busy trying to paint herself as the new face of the deal, making smooth talk in meetings with Lemoyne's team, trying to make everything look like it was progressing without a hitch. It was clear now that she thought she had everything under control. She didn't realize that the more she sidelined me, the more she was digging her own grave. I kept my distance, letting her run the show. Her confidence was her biggest weakness. As I watched her from the sidelines, I knew the moment she pushed too far was coming. When the supplier walked away, she wouldn't be able to explain it. When the deal collapsed, no one would be able to protect her from the fallout. I sat with the folder in my hands, the highlighted clause sitting quietly inside, ready for when I needed it. There would be no rush, no emotional outbursts, no desperate moves, just a quiet correction. The deal would get done, on my terms. I didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. I never did. The work I'd put in, the groundwork I'd laid, had already earned me the seat at the table. All Camille had done was walk into a game she didn't understand and overplay her hand. It was just a matter of time. The final negotiation day in Geneva arrived like any other. The air in the boardroom was thick with the hum of urgency. This was the deal that would define Alder and Penn Global's expansion into Francophone Africa. I had spent 11 months building relationships, drafting legal terms, understanding cultural nuances, and mapping out risks. Every small detail was carefully calibrated. Camille swept in, as polished as ever, her blazer perfectly fitted, a smile that seemed practiced but no less disarming. She greeted Mr. Lemoyne with the same double-cheek kiss that you'd expect from a socialite at a gala. She was trying to charm, to disarm. But what she didn't know was that the real work, the hard-won trust, had already been established. The chemistry I'd built with Lemoyne over months was what was keeping the deal in motion, not her polished smile. Then came her move. She turned to me with that smile, all sweetness and finesse. "Would you mind grabbing us some coffee while we get started?" she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. It wasn't a question. It was an order, one she thought would slide by unnoticed, as if I were just another piece in the background, just a service worker, a background player. It was subtle, yet so sharp. A final public push to edge me out of the room entirely, to make sure I was out of the way so she could take control, so she could take credit. The moment hung in the air. I stared at her, letting the weight of her request settle in for just a beat too long. Then, I turned my gaze to Mr. Lemoyne, the man I had worked so closely with. His face was unreadable, but I could see the flash of confusion in his eyes. Camille might have thought she had won, but I wasn't the one she needed to worry about. I smiled, a simple, polite gesture, and stood. I didn't rush. I didn't make a scene. But I wasn't walking away. I was simply repositioning myself for the quiet move that was coming. I turned back to Lemoyne. My voice was steady, calm, and in fluent French, I asked him a single question. "Have they informed you of the liaison transfer?" His eyebrows shot up, a slight tension building between us. I could see the realization dawn. He blinked once, slowly, as if processing my words. Then, without missing a beat, he stood up, straight, deliberate, and in perfect English he said, "Cancel the deal." The room went still. I didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't gloat. I simply watched as Camille's confident mask cracked in real time. Her polished smile faltered. Lemoyne wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone but me. And then, without a word, he gathered his papers. He didn't glance at anyone else in the room, not even Camille, before he turned and walked out of the boardroom. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence that followed. Camille stood frozen, caught in a moment she hadn't seen coming. The charm, the quick wit, the MBA-polished image, none of it had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the silent strike of a clause that wasn't meant to be used, but always would be when someone tried to push too far. I sat back down, calm, unruffled, and slid the printed contract over to her, its sharp yellow highlight marking the key clause. No drama, no raised voices, just the cold, undeniable truth. Clause 7.4b stared up at her, a quiet reminder that she had overstepped. I didn't need to explain it. The clause said everything. It was all there, in the language that both Camille and Lemoyne knew, her public slight, her desire to edge me out. It was now the very thing that would undo her. Her face went pale, the confidence draining from her as she slowly reached for the contract. She didn't speak, didn't protest. The damage had been done, and there was no coming back from it. I wasn't going to shout or explain myself. I wasn't going to let her see me revel in her downfall. There was no need. Her actions had already triggered her own defeat. I sat in silence, watching the moment unfold as the real power shifted quietly and without a word. Camille looked like she'd been slapped. Her face, which had moments earlier been bright with confidence, now drained of color. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed a little too perfect, the shine in her eyes a little too sharp, now softened by the realization that her carefully constructed image was crumbling in front of her. Lemoyne didn't say a word. He didn't offer an explanation or apologize. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for themselves. Without a glance at anyone else in the room, he stood up, calmly gathered his folder, and walked out of the boardroom. His footsteps echoed like a final verdict, as if to underscore the gravity of the moment. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the absence of words. The hum of the building, the soft rustle of papers, the subtle click of the door as it closed. These small sounds now seemed magnified. Everything around me felt muted, like the world had hit pause and was waiting for the inevitable fallout. I sat back down, keeping my movements deliberate and unhurried. The chair creaked slightly as I shifted my weight. My hands were steady as I took the printed contract and placed it neatly on the table in front of Camille, sliding it slowly toward her. I let the document linger for just a moment, as though giving it time to settle into the space between us, between the unspoken tension. The clause was highlighted, Clause 794B, the one I had added 2 years ago, quietly embedding a safeguard for moments just like this. No grand speech, no show of anger, just cold, hard leverage. Camille's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She knew the game was over. The deal she thought she could claim for herself was no longer hers to control. Her fingers hovered over the contract, her gaze flickering between the highlighted clause and the spot where Lemoyne had been sitting just moments ago. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the situation sat heavy between us, more powerful than any verbal exchange could have been. I didn't need to say anything. There was no victory in this for me, not in the way she would have expected. The power wasn't in loud triumph or public confrontation. The power was in the quiet moments, the ones no one saw coming, the ones that unfolded in the space between the lines of the contract. I let her stew in that silence. The discomfort of her failure, the humiliation of having been so thoroughly outmaneuvered was evident on her face, but it didn't matter. There was no need to rub salt in the wound. I didn't feel the need to remind her of her mistake. She already knew. She picked up the contract with shaky hands, but didn't speak. She didn't need to. The only thing left for her was to process the reality that, in a room full of power plays, she had been the one who overplayed her hand. The supplier had walked out, her mistake was documented, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. She wasn't the one in control anymore. The deal had slipped from her grasp just as quickly and silently as it had been handed to her in the first place. I watched her, still silent, slowly collect herself. She had no words, no excuses, and no chance to recover. The moment had passed. The game had been played, and I had already won. Back in New York, panic spread like wildfire. By the time I returned to the office, it was already clear that Camille's misstep had set a catastrophic chain of events in motion. The frantic emails, the hurried calls, the hastily scheduled meetings, everyone was scrambling, trying to stitch together the mess she'd left behind. But no one was looking at the heart of the issue. The deal was dead. Legal was the first to react. They threw everything they had at the problem, searching for some sort of workaround, some loophole they could exploit to salvage the situation. But the more they dug, the worse it became. Lemoyne's company had already pulled their proposal from the system, a move that left no room for negotiation. The deal had been effectively voided, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. The worst part? Camille's shortcut hadn't just ruined the deal, it had exposed her. The internal system audit, which should have been a routine check, revealed something far worse than any of us had expected. Camille had gone behind the scenes and overridden the liaison designation without notifying legal. The oversight, the failure to follow protocol, was damning, and it wasn't just a simple mistake. She had left evidence. The audit report highlighted the discrepancies, the unauthorized changes that had been made to the system. But that wasn't even the worst part. Her calendar still had the deleted email threads. The ones where she had directly coordinated with Lemoyne's team without informing me, without notifying anyone who was supposed to be in the loop. She thought she'd covered her tracks, but she hadn't. It confirmed it. The timestamp trail matched mine. Camille had tried to erase the proof, but she'd left behind a clear paper trail. Her attempted cover-up had only exposed her more. There was no hiding it anymore. The emails, the calendar invites, the system logs, they all told the same story. Camille had knowingly and willfully sidestepped protocol, and now she was paying the price. Every small, quiet misstep she'd made in her ambition had added up, and now, with the evidence laid bare, it was clear that she'd tried to play a game she wasn't prepared for. I wasn't surprised, though. I'd seen it coming. I'd known that her overconfidence, her eagerness to modernize and fix everything would lead to something like this. She thought she could just step in and take control of the deal without understanding the delicate balance of power and trust that had been built over the past months. And now it had all unraveled because she hadn't respected the process. By the time the legal team had finished their review, the situation was beyond saving. Camille had triggered Clause 7.4b without even realizing it. And now the deal was voided at the supplier's discretion. There was no recovery, no going back. The fallout was inevitable. The internal emails started flying fast and furious. Questions about how we could salvage the situation, who was going to take responsibility, and how to present this to the board. The senior leadership team was in crisis mode. They had no answers. They were lost. But none of them were looking at Camille. None of them were asking how she had let it get to this point. Instead, they were all scrambling to figure out how to save face. But it was too late. The damage had been done. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to add fuel to the fire. All I had to do was sit back and let the system do its work. Camille had left the door wide open, and now the consequences were rolling in. There was no avoiding it now. By Thursday, the full weight of the fallout hit us, delivered in cold, hard numbers from finance. The projections were grim. The losses from the canceled pipeline alone were staggering. $9.3 million in projected margin over the next 18 months. That was just the beginning. The real cost lay in the delays. The reinitiation of the contract would take a minimum of 14 weeks, which meant the deal wouldn't be back on track for months. Time was no longer on our side. To make matters worse, the investor meeting was only 5 days away. The company was counting on this deal to drive our next round of funding, and now the numbers didn't add up. The entire board was watching, and the only thing they were going to see was a deal that had slipped through our fingers. And Camille? She wasn't even in the room yet. She had already briefed leadership as if the deal was 90% done. She had painted herself as the hero, the one who had single-handedly closed the deal. She had made it seem like everything was set, that we were just putting the finishing touches on a contract that would seal our expansion into Francophone Africa. But now, the deal was dead. There was no 90% done. There was no just a few details left to iron out. All of that was a lie. The deal had unraveled the moment Camille decided to play fast and loose with the negotiation process. And now, instead of securing us a win, she had delivered us a disaster. The numbers on the sheet didn't lie. The losses weren't just a slap to the bottom line. They were a direct result of her ambition and her need to take control. She had pushed to take over, to bypass the system, to make herself the star of the show. But the system had already been in place, and her overreach had torn it apart. There was no soft way to spin this. The costs were visible, real, and unforgiving. The clock was ticking. Camille's blunders had not only jeopardized the deal, but they had also put the company in a position where we were now fighting against time to salvage what little remained. I watched as the panic spread through the leadership team. The questions began. Who would take the fall? How could we spin this to the investors? What would we tell them when they asked why the deal had collapsed? The answers were simple, though. We couldn't spin it. We couldn't hide it. Camille had made a choice to bypass the process, and now we all had to live with the consequences. The deal was gone. The timeline was shattered, and there was no way to reverse it. I didn't need to add to the chaos. I didn't need to explain it any further. The numbers spoke for themselves. The time for explanations was over. All we had now was damage control, and there wasn't much to control. The investor meeting was approaching, and the only thing left to do was figure out how to keep the company afloat while we scrambled to patch things together. But Camille? She would be the one to explain herself, to answer the questions no one else had the courage to ask. Because at the end of the day, the truth was simple. Her ambition had led to exposure, and now the clock was ticking, with no one but her to blame. That afternoon, Camille sent me a Slack message, her tone as polished as ever, but tinged with a faint undercurrent of desperation. "Hey, can we talk briefly? There's a misunderstanding I'd like to clarify, off record, if you prefer." The words hung there for a moment, almost too calculated. I could see the panic in the message, the thinly veiled attempt to reframe the situation, to make it seem like a simple mistake. She wanted to smooth things over, to find a way to salvage her position, but I wasn't interested in talking it out with her. Not anymore. I didn't reply. Instead, I let the silence linger. The silence was my answer. She had played her hand, and now it was time for someone else to take the lead. It wasn't long before I saw the email come through, this time from legal, not me. The subject line, clarification memo. I opened it, reading the first few lines with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Primary liaison override triggered clause 7.4b nullification. Documentation attached. No further contact advised. It was concise, to the point. Legal had done their job ensuring there was no room for negotiation, no wiggle room, no backpedaling. The clause was clear and it had been triggered by Camille's actions. There was no misunderstanding to clarify, no room for second chances. The deal was null and void, and Camille's attempt to spin it into a minor error had been thoroughly shut down. Attached to the memo were all the supporting documents, timestamps, email threads, system logs, all neatly organized and ready for the executive team. Camille's calendar, the deleted threads, the overridden liaison designation, they were all there in black and white, laid bare for the entire leadership team to see. And then came the final line of the memo. No further contact advised. That was the nail in the coffin. Camille had already been sidelined. No more attempts to reach out, no more backdoor negotiations. The legal team had closed the door for her, locking it with an airtight conclusion. The damage was done, and the only thing left for her to do now was face the consequences. The email went out to the executive team within minutes, and I didn't need to see their reactions to know what was coming. Camille would be summoned to explain herself. She would have to answer for what she'd done. And I wasn't going to be part of that conversation. She was panicking, I could tell. Her attempts to take control had backfired spectacularly, and now she was stuck, with no way to undo the mess she had created. But I was protected. The contract was protected. The clause I had inserted, the one that had seemed so unnecessary at the time, was now the thing that kept us from sinking further into the mire she'd dragged us into. I let the email sit for a moment, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing the process was working as it should. Camille had overplayed her hand, and now the system was doing its job. The structure we'd built, carefully, methodically, over months, was holding firm. The rules of the game hadn't changed, and she had been the one to break them. Not me. I didn't need to do anything more. I didn't need to confront her, didn't need to make a show of it. The memo from legal said everything that needed to be said. The wheels were in motion. All I had to do was wait for the fallout to reach her. Monday morning arrived with an oppressive weight in the air. The board had called an emergency session to address the crisis, one that was no longer just a hiccup in the pipeline, but a full-fledged disaster that could ripple across the company's future. As I entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The faces around the table were a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief, with a few still trying to make sense of how we'd gone from negotiating a groundbreaking deal to scrambling for damage control. The slides on the screen painted the picture in stark, cold detail: the failed negotiation, the override of the liaison designation, and the exposure that followed. Camille sat at the table, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just caused the company a multi-million-dollar setback. But the smooth veneer didn't fool me. I could see the flicker of anxiety in her eyes. She had already begun her damage control in private, but now it was all being laid bare. She opened her mouth, a rehearsed explanation at the ready. "It was a timing miscommunication," she said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "There's been a misunderstanding. The transition wasn't properly communicated, but I'm certain we can resolve this quickly." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to shift the blame away from her and onto an unfortunate series of events. But there was no room for ambiguity in this meeting, and the members of the board weren't buying it. They'd already seen the emails, the audit report, and the full extent of what had happened. Camille's attempt to minimize the situation was falling flat. She was cornered, and she knew it. The chairman, an older man with a reputation for decisiveness, didn't waste time. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Camille. "Why didn't you inform legal before replacing the liaison?" he asked, his voice calm but stern. Camille's face went pale. It was a simple question, but the weight of it hung in the air like a guillotine. She had no answer. Not one that would save her. Not one that wouldn't expose her further. She froze. The room felt like it was holding its breath. The silence stretched for what seemed like an eternity. Camille opened her mouth, but no words came out. The carefully crafted excuse she had prepared, one designed to protect her, crumbled under the scrutiny of the board. No one answered for her, not even the members who had been quietly backing her during the lead-up to this moment. They all looked away, their attention shifting to the slides that showed the hard facts, the clause, the withdrawal letter, the irrefutable documentation. The evidence was clear, and no amount of sugarcoating could change that. The chairman didn't wait for the Camille to find her voice again. Instead, he motioned to the screen behind him. The next slide flickered to life, revealing Lemoyne's formal withdrawal letter, time-stamped, translated, and signed. It was the death knell for Camille's version of events. The deal was gone. The relationship was severed, and beneath it, in both English and French, was a scanned copy of the clause I had inserted into the contract. Clause 7.4b. The clause Camille had ignored, the one that had sealed her fate. It was there, in black and white, a silent testament to her failure. I watched as Camille's gaze fell to the screen. Her face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She couldn't look away, and neither could anyone else. The room was filled with the weight of her failure, and no amount of explanation could lift it. The chairman's voice broke through the tension. "Camille," he said, his tone now colder, more formal, "you're dismissed from the team managing this deal. We'll be in touch with HR about your position going forward." It was a quiet verdict, but it was final. Camille's ambition, her desire to step into the spotlight, had collapsed in front of the very people she had sought to impress. The power plays, the attempts to edge out those who had done the real work, it had all backfired. She had underestimated the system, and now she was paying the price. I sat in silence, watching the events unfold. There was no triumph in this for me, no sense of personal victory. This wasn't about me winning or her losing. It was simply about the inevitable consequences of overreach, of failing to respect the process and the roles that had been established for a reason. Camille's ambition had led her here. She had tried to outmaneuver the very system that had allowed her to rise in the first place. And now, in front of the board, her collapse was complete. She had failed to recognize that power isn't always about being the loudest in the room. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back, when to remain silent, and when to let the rules speak for themselves. Her ambition had driven her to the edge, but it was her failure to respect the foundation of the work we had all put in that had ultimately brought her down. By the end of the month, HR sent out a generic update, something that was meant to sound neutral, detached, business as usual. Director of Global Ops, role transition pending. It was the kind of memo that didn't reveal anything substantial, but carried with it the weight of the truth. Camille was still technically in the company's employ, but it was clear to everyone that her days were numbered. By the time the quarter ended, she was gone. I never said a word about it. There was no need to. No one asked. No one needed an explanation. The situation had resolved itself quietly, and that was the beauty of it. The fallout, the exposure, and the ultimate humiliation were all just consequences of her own actions. She had done this to herself. A few weeks later, as I passed by the break room, I saw our new junior hire, fresh out of college and still smiling like he hadn't quite learned the weight of office politics. He was holding 2 coffees, one in each hand, looking slightly confused but trying to be helpful. "Grab these for Camille," he said with a grin, thinking he was being thoughtful. I nodded politely, not letting the corners of my mouth betray the smile that wanted to slip out. I didn't comment on the coffees, didn't mention the transition. Instead, I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a printed form. "Here," I said, handing it to him. "It's the designation of negotiation liaison. You'll need this." He blinked, confused for a second as he glanced from the form to me. "For Camille?" he asked, still not entirely sure what was going on. No, I said softly, meeting his eyes. For you. You're the new point of contact. He took the form from me, still puzzled, but I could see the gears turning in his head. He was beginning to understand that the weight of the role he was taking on wasn't just about attending meetings and sending emails. It was about holding responsibility. Camille had tried to edge me out. She had tried to push me aside, to replace me with a flashier, more polished version of herself. But in the end, all she had done was overplay her hand, and I, quietly, without fanfare, had reclaimed control. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to make a spectacle. I didn't need to say anything at all. I just raised the clause, and it had worked exactly as it was supposed to.